12 worst figures in Black church history. What if the voices people trusted most were hiding stories no one wanted to hear? Behind powerful sermons and growing congregations were moments that would later shake entire communities. Tonight, we step into those stories where faith, influence, and controversy collide. Stay with us until the end, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Black Legends Revealed for more deep, thought-provoking revelations. T.B. Joshua. T.B. Joshua's story moved with the scale of a legend and the tension of a warning. Born Temitope Balogun Joshua in Nigeria in 1963, he built the Synagogue Church of All Nations in Lagos into one of the most influential ministries on the continent, drawing pilgrims from Africa, Europe, Asia, and the Americas. His Emmanuel T5 broadcasts carried his image far beyond the pulpit, turning him into a religious celebrity whose reach by many accounts rivaled that of major public figures in Nigeria. To supporters, he was a healer, a prophet, a man whose prayers could interrupt suffering. To critics, he represented the danger of charisma, becoming authority without restraint. That contrast is what makes his name so hard to place neatly in history. Then came the moment that changed the tone of his legacy. On September 12, 2014, a guest house within the church compound collapsed, killing 116 people, most of them foreign visitors who had come seeking spiritual help. A coroner later held the church responsible through criminal negligence, while Joshua publicly suggested sabotage and other causes. The grief that followed reached far beyond Lagos. It turned one ministry into an international controversy. Years later, another storm deepened the division around him when YouTube removed his channel after videos circulated showing violent deliverance sessions aimed at gay people. When faith becomes power, who is bold enough to question it? That question sits at the center of his story. When Joshua died suddenly on June 5, 2021, at age 57, mourning and suspicion rose side by side. That is why he fits a title about the most controversial figures in Black church history. He was not a minor preacher caught in a local scandal. He was a global religious force whose ministry inspired fierce devotion and equally fierce criticism. In the end, his life left behind more than crowd sermons or headlines. It left a divided memory, one built from belief, grief, influence, and the haunting question of how far charisma should ever be allowed to go. Eddie Long. Eddie Long did not move through the public imagination like a Hollywood celebrity. He moved like a religious empire in motion-tailored suits, stadium-sized sermons, a pulpit built for command. As senior pastor of New Birth Missionary Baptist Church in Georgia, he helped grow the congregation from a few hundred members into one of the most visible megachurches in the country. His image was carefully constructed: strength, certainty, discipline, masculine authority. That is what made the collapse so dramatic. In 2010, Long faced lawsuits from young men who accused him of using spiritual influence and gifts to draw them into sexual relationships when they were teenagers. He denied the allegations, and the cases were later settled out of court in 2011 without a public trial on the facts. What made the story so explosive was not only the accusation itself, but the public contradiction surrounding it. Long had built part of his national profile through forceful preaching, including rhetoric against homosexuality, which made the scandal hit with even greater force. The fall was not cinematic because it was loud. It was cinematic because it exposed what happens when a man spends years projecting invulnerability and then watches that image crack under the weight of public scrutiny. What happens when the man preaching certainty becomes the center of doubt? That question haunted the story more than any single sermon ever could. By the time Eddie Long died in January 2017, after what his church described as an aggressive form of cancer, his legacy had already split into irreconcilable pieces. One part remembered the builder of a massive ministry. Another remembered the scandal that permanently altered how he was seen. That is why, if you place him in a script at all, he should not be framed as someone who redefined the image of gay people in Hollywood. He fits better as a figure of public contradiction, someone whose story revealed the violence that can grow inside performance denial and unchecked authority. Kevin O. Smith. Kevin O. Smith's story does not unfold like an ordinary church scandal. It feels darker than that because it begins in the familiar language of faith and ends in terror. As leader of Pathways International Kingdom Restoration Ministries in Montego Bay, Jamaica Smith presented himself as a prophet with unusual spiritual authority, a man who claimed to hear directly from God and lead believers toward salvation. For followers, that image carried tremendous force. He was not simply a pastor delivering sermons on Sundays. He was treated as a vessel of divine instruction, someone whose words could shape decisions, fears, and hopes. That is what makes his story so unsettling within the history of the Black church. The same charisma that drew people in would later become the very thing that made them vulnerable. Everything changed on the night of October 17, 2021. According to survivors and authorities, Smith led what he described as a special deliverance ritual inside his church. But what was supposed to be a moment of spiritual breakthrough turned into deadly violence. 2 members were stabbed to death, others were injured, and witnesses fled in panic before alerting police. When officers arrived, they encountered what the transcript describes as a horrifying scene: blood on the floor, dazed survivors, and signs of ritual violence. Smith was arrested and charged with murder, terrorism-related offenses, and conspiracy. How does a congregation realize the man they trusted has led them somewhere they never imagined they would go? That question sits in the middle of this tragedy, because the horror was not only in the killings themselves, but in the path of manipulation that made such obedience possible. Days later, while being transported to court, Smith died in a vehicle crash along with a police officer. His death ended the legal process, but not the damage. The community was left with grief, confusion, and the lasting shock of how quickly spiritual devotion could be twisted into something destructive. That is why Kevin O. Smith belongs in a story about the most controversial figures in Black church history. His name is tied not just to scandal, but to one of the most chilling examples of faith collapsing into fanaticism, leaving behind a legacy marked by fear, loss, and broken trust. Creflo Dollar. Creflo Dollar's rise did not happen in a vacuum. It unfolded alongside a new vision of faith that promised not only salvation but success. Born in Georgia in 1962, he founded World Changers Church International in 1986 with just a handful of members. Within a few decades, that modest beginning grew into a global ministry reaching tens of thousands in person and millions through television. His message was direct and compelling: belief, discipline, and giving could unlock material blessing. For many followers, his success seemed to embody that promise. The tailored suits, luxury homes, and international reach were not hidden. They were presented as evidence that faith properly practiced could transform a life. That image became central to his influence. But the same image that inspired devotion also drew scrutiny. In 2015, Dollar publicly asked supporters to contribute toward the purchase of a $65 million Gulfstream G650 jet, arguing that commercial travel limited his ability to spread the gospel. The request sparked immediate backlash across media and among observers who questioned whether such extravagance aligned with spiritual leadership. Years earlier, in 2012, he had also faced legal trouble following a domestic dispute involving his teenage daughter. The case was later resolved without a conviction after he completed counseling. For critics, these moments reinforced concerns about the blurred line between ministry and personal empire. When does prosperity stop looking like blessing and start raising difficult questions about power? That tension sits at the center of his public story. Yet Creflo Dollar's legacy is not defined by one narrative alone. His teachings continued to reach a wide audience, and in 2022 he made a rare public shift, acknowledging that some of his earlier interpretations on tithing had been misguided and urging followers to reconsider them. For some, that moment signaled reflection and growth. For others, it came too late to restore trust. What remains is a figure who reshaped modern church culture through visibility, influence, and debate. His story reflects a larger conversation about faith, wealth, and responsibility, one that continues to divide opinion and challenge how spiritual authority is understood in the modern world. Father Divine. Father Divine's story feels almost mythic in its scale, shaped by a time when desperation made belief powerful and charisma could transform a man into something more. Born George Baker in the late 19th century, he emerged during the Great Depression as a figure who offered certainty in an uncertain world. Through the peace mission movement, he drew thousands who saw in him not just a preacher, but a living embodiment of divine authority. He preached racial equality, economic independence, and communal living, creating heavens, shared homes where followers surrendered wages and possessions in exchange for stability, discipline, and spiritual assurance. In a nation fractured by poverty and segregation, that vision carried immense appeal. To many, he was not symbolic. He was literal. Yet the same devotion that built his movement also raised questions that have never fully faded. Father Divine insisted he was God on earth, a claim that drew both reverence and skepticism. His followers lived modestly under strict rules, while he himself resided in comfort, surrounded by wealth generated through the very system he created. Moments like his 1932 arrest for disturbing the peace and the sudden death of the judge days later, which he reportedly addressed with unsettling confidence, only deepened the aura around him. At what point does belief become something no longer questioned, even when contradictions stand in plain sight? That question sits at the center of his legacy, because his influence depended as much on perception as on doctrine. By the mid-20th century, Father Divine had built an empire of businesses, properties, and devoted communities that stretched far beyond Harlem. But as new movements emerged and his presence faded, the structure he created began to weaken without him. When he died in 1965, what remained was not a simple story of faith or deception, but something far more complicated. His life continues to be studied as a reflection of how leadership, belief, and need can intersect in powerful ways. In the end, Father Divine did not just build a movement. He reshaped the boundary between devotion and doubt, leaving behind a legacy that still invites interpretation rather than conclusion. Carlton Pearson. Carlton Pearson matters to this conversation not because he looked like a Hollywood star, but because he confronted one of the forces that helped shape how gay people were seen across American culture, the Black church's power to bless, reject, or redefine belonging. At his height, Pearson was no fringe preacher. He was a rising Pentecostal bishop, a frequent presence on Trinity Broadcasting Network, and the founder of Higher Dimensions Family Church in Tulsa, which grew to roughly 6,000 members by the turn of the century. Then he made a turn that cost him nearly everything. After embracing what he called the gospel of inclusion, rejecting eternal hell, and publicly supporting gay rights, he was declared heretical in 2004 by the Joint College of African American Pentecostal Bishops Congress. Membership collapsed, relationships fractured, and the ministry he built began to disintegrate in public. That is the real center of his story. Not celebrity, not scandal, cost. Pearson's shift was not a small adjustment in language. It was a direct challenge to the machinery of fear that had long been used against queer people in religious life. He stepped away from a theology that threatened damnation and moved toward one that widened the circle. The punishment was severe. He lost institutional protection, resigned from Oral Roberts University's board, split from his mentor Oral Roberts, and watched his church fall into foreclosure before preaching his final sermon there in 2008. Have you ever seen a man keep speaking after the room that once applauded him turns its back? That is where the drama lives, in the loneliness of conviction when acceptance vanishes. Later, Pearson became a minister in the United Church of Christ, helped lead clergy support for federal hate crime and job discrimination protections for gay people, and saw his collapse retold in Come Sunday, the 2018 film based on his story. He died in 2023 after years of battling cancer. He does not redefine the image of gay people in Hollywood in the direct way an actor would. He reveals something darker and more important: how fiercely power resists inclusion and how expensive it becomes when a black religious leader decides queer people belong inside the promise instead of outside the gate. Daddy Grace. Sweet Daddy Grace entered American religious life with a sense of spectacle that few could match. Born Marcelino Manuel da Graca in 1881 in Cape Verde, he arrived in the United States as an immigrant laborer and rose within decades to lead the United House of Prayer for All People. His services were unlike the quiet reverence many expected from church. They moved with rhythm music and ceremony-drawing working-class congregants who found both energy and reassurance in his message. Grace's presence was unmistakable: tailored suits, jeweled rings, long, carefully maintained nails, an image that signaled authority and success in a world that often denied both to people like his followers. To many, his prosperity was not excess. It was proof that faith could elevate the overlooked. But the same image that inspired devotion also invited scrutiny. Offerings were not simply collected. They were displayed, carried forward in dramatic processions that blurred the line between worship and performance. Grace expanded his ministry into businesses, selling everyday items presented as spiritually meaningful. Critics questioned whether such practices crossed into exploitation, while supporters saw them as expressions of belief and participation. His wealth grew alongside his influence, creating a visible contrast between the modest lives of many followers and the opulence surrounding their leader. When faith and spectacle become inseparable, where does devotion end and performance begin? That tension defines how his story continues to be understood. By the 1950s, Sweet Daddy Grace had built a far-reaching network of churches, properties, and enterprises that extended across multiple states. His movement survived his death in 1960, though never with the same intensity that surrounded him in life. What remains is a legacy that resists simple judgment. He offered structure, community, and hope to thousands, yet also embodied a model of leadership that raised enduring questions about power, image, and influence. His story stands as a reminder that charisma can inspire collective belief on a remarkable scale, while also shaping perceptions that are still debated long after the figure at the center is gone. Grace. Sweet Daddy Grace entered American religious life with a sense of spectacle that few could match. Born Marcelino Manuel da Graca in 1881 in Cape Verde, he arrived in the United States as an immigrant laborer and rose within decades to lead the United House of Prayer for All People. His services were unlike the quiet reverence many expected from church. They moved with rhythm music and ceremony-drawing working-class congregants who found both energy and reassurance in his message. Grace's presence was unmistakable. Tailored suits, jeweled rings, long, carefully maintained nails, an image that signaled authority and success in a world that often denied both to people like his followers. To many, his prosperity was not excess. It was proof that faith could elevate the overlooked. But the same image that inspired devotion also invited scrutiny. Offerings were not simply collected, they were displayed, carried forward in dramatic processions that blurred the line between worship and performance. Grace expanded his ministry into businesses selling everyday items presented as spiritually meaningful. Critics questioned whether such practices crossed into exploitation, while supporters saw them as expressions of belief and participation. His wealth grew alongside his influence, creating a visible contrast between the modest lives of many followers and the opulence surrounding their leader. When faith and spectacle become inseparable, where does devotion end and performance begin? That tension defines how his story continues to be understood. By the 1950s, Sweet Daddy Grace had built a far-reaching network of churches, properties, and enterprises that extended across multiple states. His movement survived his death in 1960, though never with the same intensity that surrounded him in life. What remains is a legacy that resists simple judgment. He offered structure, community, and hope to thousands, yet also embodied a model of leadership that raised enduring questions about power, image, and influence. His story stands as a reminder that charisma can inspire collective belief on a remarkable scale, while also shaping perceptions that are still debated long after the figure at the center is gone. Jeremiah Wright. Jeremiah Wright's voice did not rise softly. It carried the weight of history shaped by decades in the pulpit, and a tradition that refused to separate faith from the struggle for justice. Born in 1941, he led Trinity United Church of Christ in Chicago for more than 30 years, growing it into a congregation of thousands. His preaching drew from Black liberation theology, connecting scripture to the lived realities of racism, inequality, and resilience. Within his church, he was not simply a pastor. He was a guide who spoke to pain that many felt but rarely heard acknowledged so directly. That foundation gave his ministry both strength and visibility, especially as it intersected with broader cultural and political conversations. That visibility reached a turning point in 2008. As Barack Obama's presidential campaign gained momentum, clips from Wright's past sermons surfaced in national media. One line in particular, delivered years earlier, was replayed repeatedly, stripped of its full context, and presented as a defining statement. The reaction was immediate and intense, turning a local religious voice into a national controversy. For supporters, his words reflected anger rooted in historical injustice. For critics, they signaled division and extremity. The moment forced a deeper public reckoning not only about Wright's message, but about how America listens to voices shaped by different experiences. What happens when a message meant for one community is judged by an audience that never shared its context? That question lingered far beyond the headlines. The consequences were lasting. Obama ultimately distanced himself, ending a long relationship in order to preserve his campaign. Wright retired that same year, but his legacy remained tied to that moment of exposure. For some, he became a symbol of necessary truth spoken without compromise. For others, he represented the risks of rhetoric that can be misunderstood or misused. Yet beyond the controversy, his decades of ministry focused on education, community programs, and social advocacy continue to shape how he is remembered. Jeremiah Wright's story is not defined by a single soundbite, but by the tension between message and perception, a reminder of how powerful words can travel far beyond the room in which they were first spoken. Juanita Bynum. Juanita Bynum's voice rose out of struggle and found its power in testimony. Born in Chicago in 1959, she built her early ministry through preaching, music, and writing that spoke directly to women navigating faith identity and self-worth. Her conferences filled large venues, her books reached wide audiences, and her presence carried a mix of intensity and intimacy that resonated deeply. She positioned herself not just as a teacher, but as someone who understood the private battles many carried in silence. That connection became the foundation of her influence, allowing her to move beyond the pulpit into a broader cultural space where faith met personal transformation. In 2002, her highly publicized marriage to Bishop Thomas Weeks III appeared to embody the message she preached: unity, strength, and spiritual partnership. For a time, they were presented as a model of shared purpose, speaking together about relationships and ministry. But in 2007, that image shattered in a moment that unfolded in public view. After a violent incident involving her husband, Bynum became not only a religious figure, but a survivor whose experience forced a difficult conversation about abuse within faith communities. She chose to speak openly about what happened, reframing her story in a way that addressed both pain and resilience. When a public figure's life breaks in full view, does that vulnerability weaken their voice or deepen it? That question shaped how her journey was received. In the years that followed, Bynum continued to preach right and build her platform, though not without renewed scrutiny. Critics questioned aspects of her ministry, including the commercialization of spiritual materials, while supporters pointed to her ability to rebuild and continue reaching those in need of guidance. Her legacy remains layered, marked by influence, controversy, and reinvention. She stands as a figure who moved through both acclaim and hardship under constant visibility, leaving behind a narrative that reflects not a single defining moment, but an ongoing negotiation between faith, personal experience, and public perception. Kirbyjon Caldwell. The rise of Kirbyjon Caldwell once carried the quiet confidence of a man who understood both power and presence. Born in 1953, Caldwell did not begin in a pulpit, but in the structured world of finance, working as an investment banker before stepping into ministry. That dual identity shaped the voice he would later bring to Windsor Village United Methodist Church in Houston, where he built one of the largest congregations in the United Methodist denomination. His sermons blended spiritual conviction with pragmatic language about wealth discipline and purpose, drawing in thousands, including influential figures such as George W. Bush, whom Caldwell counseled during moments of personal reflection. For years, his image rested on that balance, a pastor fluent in both faith and the mechanics of success. Yet the rhythm of that story shifted when financial promises began to blur into legal scrutiny. In 2018, Caldwell was indicted on federal charges tied to an investment scheme involving millions of dollars, where victims were persuaded to place trust not only in a business venture, but in the credibility of a spiritual leader. By 2020, he pleaded guilty to wire fraud, admitting his role in orchestrating transactions that diverted funds for personal use. The courtroom replaced the sanctuary as the central stage, and the language changed from sermons about stewardship to testimonies about misrepresentation. How does trust transform when the voice that once guided it becomes the source of its fracture? He was sentenced to prison, a fall that did not erase his past influence, but reframed it entirely. Even after serving time and returning to ministry in a reduced capacity, the weight of that chapter lingers in every mention of his name. Caldwell's journey now sits at an uneasy intersection: leadership and accountability, inspiration and consequence. It is not a simple narrative of rise or fall, but something more complicated, where charisma once opened doors, and later the same authority magnified the cost of broken trust. Paul Lewis. Paul Lewis rose with the cadence of a revival voice, measured, persuasive, and built for large rooms. Born in Jamaica and later based in New York, he became known in the early 2000s for crusades that drew thousands across the Caribbean, Africa, and the United States. His sermons leaned into urgency and possibility, blending dramatic altar calls with promises of transformation that resonated with audiences seeking direction. For a time, his trajectory suggested expansion without limits, a ministry crossing borders and gaining momentum with each gathering. That image of a preacher on the rise set the stage for everything that followed. In 2009, that trajectory shifted abruptly. During a crusade in Jamaica, allegations emerged involving a teenage attendee, leading to charges that quickly became international news. The case moved through the courts for nearly 2 years, drawing intense attention from supporters and critics alike. In 2011, a jury acquitted Lewis, with his defense pointing to inconsistencies in testimony. Legally, the case ended there. Publicly, it did not. Invitations slowed, attendance dropped, and a ministry that once filled venues struggled to regain its footing. When a courtroom delivers an answer, but doubt remains in the public mind, what truly defines a person's legacy? That question lingers because the gap between legal resolution and public trust can be difficult to close. Lewis attempted to rebuild, returning to preaching and outreach, yet the scale had changed. What had once been a rapidly expanding platform became a more limited presence, shaped by memory as much as by message. His story now sits within a broader conversation about leadership accountability and the fragility of reputation in faith communities. It reflects how quickly perception can shift and how enduring those shifts can be, even when formal judgments do not confirm wrongdoing. In that space between belief and uncertainty, his legacy continues to be debated rather than settled. James Francis Marion Jones. James Francis Marion Jones, known to the public as Prophet Jones, moved through mid-century Detroit like a figure built for both devotion and spectacle. Born in Birmingham in 1907 and sent north as a young missionary, he turned radio, then television, into a pulpit large enough to carry his voice across the Midwest. By the 1940s and 1950s, he had built the Church of Universal Triumph Dominion of God into a major force, drawing packed crowds with healing services, bold self-presentation, and a style that made him impossible to ignore. He did not preach like a modest neighborhood pastor. He arrived in white mink, lived grandly, and spoke with the certainty of a man who believed ordinary religious language was too small for the image he wanted to project. That was the center of his power and the beginning of his trouble. Prophet Jones understood performance before many preachers understood media, and he used it brilliantly. He hosted one of Detroit's earliest weekly television ministries led by a black preacher, and followers saw in him a man touched by divine favor. Critics, though, saw something more: unsettling excess self-mythology and a ministry wrapped in personal magnificence. Then came the turning point in 1956, when his arrest on a morals charge ignited a press storm that shook his reputation and stripped away much of the invincible aura he had built. He was later acquitted, with later accounts emphasizing entrapment, but the damage had already been done. Can charisma survive once the headlines turn against it? What makes Prophet Jones fit a title about controversial black church history is not simply scandal, but contradiction. He was a religious innovator, a media pioneer, and a symbol of how faith, celebrity, money, and public appetite can collide inside one life. Even after the worst years of scrutiny, his name never disappeared from Detroit memory. When he died in 1971, thousands still came to pay their respects, a final reminder that influence does not vanish neatly just because public opinion shifts. His story remains compelling because it never settles into one simple meaning: part warning, part phenomenon, part unanswered question about what people seek when they follow a man who seems larger than the church itself. What you've seen tonight isn't just history, it's a reflection of power, faith, and the fragile line between them. Some of these figures built hope. Others left behind questions that still echo today. But here's what remains unsettled. Were they flawed leaders navigating impossible expectations, or did they cross lines that should never be crossed? And more importantly, how should we remember them? Share your thoughts below, because this conversation is far from over. If you want more stories that challenge perspective and uncover hidden truths, follow and subscribe to Black Legends Revealed.